Letitia James never trusted coincidences, especially not the kind that arrived in armored SUVs and made noise beneath the hood. So, when the engine in her private vehicle sputtered and coughed to a halt just outside a corner of Brooklyn, she didn't call her driver. She didn't call for a federal technician either. Instead, she drove it herself straight into a nameless garage tucked between a halal cart depot and a boarded-up laundromat off East Tremont. No security detail, no warning. Just Letitia, standing in the misty rain of the Bronx with her coat still buttoned, giving the kind of look that didn't invite conversation. It made a sound, she said flatly. When I stopped in Brooklyn, check it. That was all. She didn't give her name. She didn't need to. Inside, the girl didn't ask questions. Emily, 17, flannel sleeves rolled, combat boots stained from 2 oil changes earlier, just nodded and rolled the SUV inside like she did with every other machine that showed up broken and uninvited. She didn't care who Letitia was. Not yet. Her focus was on the sound. She had heard 1,000 engines die, but this one made her pause before she even opened the hood. The air had that sharp, electric taste ozone and something burnt. Not gas, not oil, current. She reached for a flashlight, flipped it once, and without a word started tracing the auxiliary wiring with her eyes, not her hands. There it was, hidden just out of reach beneath the fuse relay, where no civilian tech would think to look. A cluster of components jammed into a space meant for cooling. But this wasn't part of any manufacturer's blueprint. This was something else. Compact directional mic, vibration filter, a heat sink shaped like a tooth fragment, and no markings, no logo, not even a serial. It shouldn't have been there. Which meant it had a reason to be. Emily didn't touch it. She just studied it, light in one hand, breath steady, and muttered almost to herself, "This isn't for civilians." Letitia walked back in just then, heels clicking once across the garage floor. She stopped when she saw Emily hadn't moved an inch. No questions, no report, just silence. And then Emily turned her head, calm as rain, and asked one question. "Do you usually park near military bases?" Letitia didn't answer right away. Her posture didn't shift, but her face did. Slightly. Enough to register that this wasn't a girl with lucky guesses. This was something else entirely. And that's where we start. Not in a courtroom, not on a podium, but inside a grease-stained garage where a 17-year-old with no badge, no clearance, and no agenda just looked the Attorney General of New York in the eye and made her flinch. You're listening to Voice of Power. And this isn't about car trouble. It's about a signal buried where no one was supposed to find it. This is the story of what happened when a teenage mechanic ran head first into the kind of surveillance no government would admit exists, and a top law enforcement official realized the most dangerous breach of her career might have started beneath the hood of her own vehicle. No theories, no conspiracies, just wires, heat, and a question that hit harder than any headline. What was that thing doing inside Letitia James's car? Well, let Emily show you what she found. Because from here on out, the garage is no longer just a garage, and the girl you never heard of might be the only one who knows how to keep this whole thing from blowing wide open. Emily didn't blink. She didn't ask for backup. She didn't even reach for gloves. She simply stepped away from the car, pulled the lid off an old metal toolbox, flipped it upside down, and started sketching on its greasy underside with the tip of a permanent marker that had seen better days. The lines came fast-angled, precise, looping in and out like circuitry from a machine that hadn't been invented yet. But this wasn't just some bored mechanic doodling a hypothesis. She was mapping an alien presence, something that didn't belong in any American-made vehicle, let alone the private SUV of New York's top law enforcement officer. 15 minutes. That's all she asked for. And in that silence, the air around her changed. She traced a set of what looked like backflow signals, non-standard, mismatched voltage spikes traveling against the expected current. Not from the ignition, not from the onboard diagnostics. These weren't designed to monitor an engine, they were designed to monitor a person. She pulled back the insulation beneath the rear seat, peeling away the acoustic foam like it was a Band-Aid over a bullet wound. And there it was, buried under 2 layers of soundproofing. A thumb-sized device, matte black, with 4 micro-antennas folded like insect legs. No corporate stamp, no FCC registration, no QR code, just raw menace. It had no business being in a civilian car unless your idea of casual road trips includes quantum-range audio surveillance with directional voice targeting capabilities. If that sounds like a mouthful, it's because it was never meant to be spoken out loud. This was hardware that didn't get patents. It got deniability. Emily stared at it with a face as unreadable as the device itself. She didn't touch it. She didn't need to. A mechanic learns early. When something doesn't belong, you don't try to fix it. You identify it, and you call it by its name. Letitia stepped back into the room, arms folded, heels clicking like punctuation marks on a sentence she hadn't started yet. Before she could speak, Emily beat her to it, calm, almost bored. "You're being surveilled," she said, "by something even the DOD wouldn't recognize on a bad day." That was the moment the mood changed. Letitia didn't argue. She didn't roll her eyes or accuse Emily of exaggerating. She simply turned to her staff and issued one line. "Shut it down. Lock the place. No one in or out." The garage, once just a shelter for busted transmissions and overpriced brake jobs, suddenly became a sealed perimeter. A junior staffer stepped forward, confused. He asked Emily who she was, because that's what people do when a young woman in boots and shop grease starts speaking with more authority than their own chain of command. Emily didn't look up. "I'm the only one here who doesn't think that thing is an engine problem." And that right there was the first shot fired. It's funny, isn't it? How a surveillance-grade listening device gets installed in a top official's SUV and nobody notices until a teenager with a Sharpie and no security clearance redraws the battlefield on the bottom of a damn toolbox lid. But here's the part that should keep you up at night. Letitia James didn't dismiss her. She didn't question the diagnosis. She didn't laugh. She asked for everything starting now. And that should tell you something. Because when the Attorney General of New York decides that a teenage mechanic might be the only person in the room worth listening to, it's not just a fluke. It's a red flag planted right in the heart of the state's power structure. So, ask yourself, who put that device there? How long had it been listening? And why did it take someone who wasn't even old enough to vote to notice that the hum in the wires wasn't mechanical, it was intentional? We're not dealing with engine trouble. We're dealing with systems built to pretend they're invisible. Systems that only fear people who know how to look under the surface. Emily didn't ask to be part of the story. She became the threat because she noticed what the professionals missed. And the real punchline? The people who planted that device didn't expect anyone to find it, certainly not someone with oil on her hands and high school still on her transcript. But here's the thing about overlooked minds. They're the ones who know where to look when everyone else is busy rehearsing press briefings. The question now isn't whether Letitia's car was bugged. That's already established. The question is Who wanted her heard and why? The answer lies buried in frequencies, in data loops that never hit a dashboard, and in signals that had no business being decoded by a kid from the Bronx. But someone decoded them, and now the people who built the silence are about to hear what it sounds like when it finally breaks. Well, take you inside what happened next when Letitia James looked Emily in the eye and gave her full clearance, not because of who she was, but because of what she already knew. Stay with us. The door clicked shut behind her with the kind of finality usually reserved for subpoenas and last rites. Emily sat in a chair that had clearly been bolted to the floor for the comfort of people who thought intimidation was a furniture style. Across from her, two men in button-downs rolled up to the elbows just enough to look off the record, but not enough to hide the fact that they were both carrying flipped-open folders like they expected her to crack under the weight of stationery. They didn't offer coffee. They didn't need to. Their job was in hospitality. It was doubt. "Start from the beginning," the older one said, with the weary tone of a man who had read too many conspiracy blogs and couldn't believe life had finally handed him one. "You recognize that device. Why?" Emily didn't blink. She didn't ask for a lawyer. Instead, she calmly reached for the projector remote sitting on the conference table, snapped off the back panel with a thumbnail, and held it up. "Because if I wanted to hide a signal," she said, "I'd start with something no one checks, something boring, something assumed." She pointed to the RFID chip mounted backwards inside. "See? Wrong orientation. But it still pings, just takes longer. Most people never notice." "But the right people? They're not supposed to." Silence. Then came the obligatory government-scripted suspicion. "You ever work for anyone?" one of them asked. The subtext wasn't subtle. "Who sent you, and why aren't you wearing a badge?" Emily took her time answering, letting the moment stretch long enough to make both men shift in their chairs. "No, I never worked for any agency. But my grandfather dismantled intercept towers at Camp Casey in '78. My dad was EOD for 12 years, 6 of them off books. I didn't learn this stuff from YouTube." The younger agent snorted, as if family history was just an origin story for overconfident weirdos. "So, what, you picked it up in your backyard?" Emily smiled. Not smug, just sure. At 6, I was pulling antennas out of broken radios. At 10, I could spoof a police scanner with parts from a discarded microwave and a lawn sprinkler timer. Nobody taught me how to weaponize it. They just never stopped me from figuring it out. They didn't like that answer. It had too many verbs and not enough fear. So they did what government men do when their folders stop working. They turned hostile. "You could be the one who planted the device," one of them said. Not a question. A charge. Thinly veiled. Lazily delivered. Emily turned her head slowly. Her voice didn't rise. Her posture didn't change, but her eyes landed on him like a lens adjusting focus. "If I planted it," she said, each word laid with surgical precision, "you wouldn't have found it." It was the kind of line that doesn't require a mic drop because the room drops itself. The men didn't respond right away, mostly because they couldn't think of a way to argue with someone who'd just proved she could bury a signal so deep they'd still be looking for it next year. Their faces froze somewhere between indignation and a dawning sense of irrelevance. And then Letitia finally spoke. She hadn't said a word since walking in. She'd just stood there in the corner, watching like a prosecutor deciding whether a witness was a surprise asset or a future liability. But now her voice cut through the fog with a quiet, lethal edge. "Enough," she said. Not a suggestion. A verdict. "I'm asking you, Emily, where do you think this came from?" Emily didn't hesitate. Not domestic, not friendly, and not the first time. And there it was, the sentence that reconfigured the gravity in the room. Because if it wasn't domestic and it wasn't friendly, then someone had just admitted the breach wasn't local. It was strategic, intentional, and if it wasn't the first time, it meant this wasn't a fluke. It was policy. That's the part no one in the room wanted to admit. A 17-year-old just gave a more accurate threat assessment than the people with encrypted phones and Pentagon clearances. But this is how systems collapse, not with an explosion, but with an observation no one was supposed to make. Emily didn't accuse anyone. She didn't point fingers. She just presented facts, quiet, undeniable facts that made the machinery of plausible deniability sputter like a dying carburetor. So, if you're wondering what kind of world we live in, where a teenage mechanic knows more about national security vulnerabilities than the adults paid to prevent them, the answer is simple. A world that stopped listening to the wrong people and started ignoring the right ones. And if you think that interrogation room was the end of it, think again. That was just the warm-up. Because the real question isn't whether Emily's right. It's what she's about to do with what she knows, and who's about to realize they've already lost control of the narrative. Field Access Unit 7 looked less like a federal command post and more like a utility trailer that had survived a failed FEMA contract. No guards, no retina scanners, just a faded metal door, a flickering overhead bulb, and a folding table that had probably hosted more coffee stains than classified briefings. But inside that unimpressive shell, a shift in hierarchy was happening, a quiet recalibration of authority. Letitia James, who once prosecuted financial fraud with a voice sharp enough to make Wall Street stutter, now sat silently across from a 17-year-old in combat boots, handing over military-grade schematics like they were overdue homework. No fanfare, no posturing, just one line. You're not here as a suspect. You're here as an engineer. Emily barely reacted. She took the manila folder with the same casual precision she used when rewiring an alternator. Inside were photos, close-ups of the device she'd found embedded in Letitia's SUV, thermal maps, microstructure scans, power trace logs, the kind of technical porn that made agency lifers whisper in acronyms and pretend they'd seen it all before. But Emily didn't gawk. She flipped through each image like she already knew what she'd find and was just waiting for the adults to catch up. Then, she asked for something specific, the full schematic set from the factory that had assembled the SUV. "Start with the interior sensor matrix," she said, "and pull the batch records on the electronic control units. I want to see every junction and jumper." The technician on standby, mid-40s, overpaid, underqualified, blinked like she'd asked him to recite the alphabet backward in Sanskrit. Letitia didn't wait. "Give her everything she needs," she snapped. 15 minutes later, Emily was on the floor with a dry erase marker and a roll of printer paper taped together into a makeshift blueprint. She traced one route, then stopped. Traced another. Paused again. "This doesn't match," she muttered. "The data rail from the central control unit should run through this path." She jabbed her finger at the diagram, but the signal from the device I found bypassed this loop entirely. She pulled up a screenshot from the thermal overlay. "And this alloy here, G11, that's not commercial grade. That's not even black market. That's prototype." Letitia leaned in. "Meaning?" Emily looked up. "Meaning it doesn't exist in any official manufacturing stream. This kind of heat tolerance doesn't show up in civilian tech. It was only referenced once in a research trial from last year involving adaptive field-embedded nanomaterials. No licensing, no export record, and it never made it to market. Now, Any reasonable federal agent at this point might have stopped to digest that, but not the guy in the corner with the government badge and the cognitive dissonance problem. "There are a dozen labs experimenting with alloys," he said, puffing his chest like a peacock who'd read half a white paper. "Could have come from anywhere." Emily didn't even bother to lift her eyes. Except there's only one filing in the International Materials Registry that matches the lattice signature of this specific G11 variant. It was submitted under a company called Orion Environmental Systems. Letitia narrowed her eyes. "That's not a DoD contractor." Emily stood, flipped to the registry printout she'd requested ahead of time, and pointed. "No, it's not. They tried to register the alloy last year but were denied. Reason: lack of verifiable national origin, no clear manufacturing base, no traceable board of directors, just a Delaware address and a web domain hosted out of, wait for it, Macau." Letitia froze. "You're saying the people who made this aren't just smuggling military-grade components into civilian vehicles? They're manufacturing them." Emily didn't hesitate. "Not access, production. You're not dealing with a breach. You're looking at a pipeline, one that builds the thing before it even becomes illegal. Now, let's pause here to appreciate the absurdity of this revelation. Somewhere in the deep files of a government that can't seem to manage potholes or passport renewals without a 3-month delay, a ghost company with no flag, no face, and no public footprint had quietly filed for materials that didn't technically exist, and no one blinked. But a high school senior with a Sharpie, a garage light, and a chip on her shoulder traced it back in a single afternoon. This is the part where the room goes quiet. Not because of respect, but because no one wants to say what they're thinking. We're too late. Letitia, to her credit, didn't panic. She turned to the agent beside her. "Run a full check on Orion, corporate history, shell transfers, every name that touched their registration." But Emily wasn't done. "You'll find proxies and fronts and maybe a few offshore LLCs wrapped around each other like a Russian nesting doll of liability. And what do you think they're hiding?" Letitia asked. Emily didn't flinch. Control. The ability to monitor, disrupt, and, if necessary, erase. Not from the outside. From inside the system. Before the system even knows it's been breached. If that doesn't make your skin crawl, it should. Because this isn't espionage as we know it. This isn't wiretaps and back doors and dudes with sunglasses typing in vans. This is pre-infiltration manufacturing. It's the future of surveillance written in the raw materials of your consumer goods. And now, Letitia James, Attorney General, political warrior, woman who's faced off with the Trump Organization and the NRA alike, is standing in a metal box in the Bronx, realizing that the biggest threat to national integrity might not be a foreign nation or a rogue hacker, but a factory in someone's blind spot, armed with plausible deniability and a material science degree. But here's the kicker. Emily figured it out before anyone else, and the real question now is not what this means for Letitia's SUV. It's what happens when they realize that the girl who cracked the silence is still just warming up. The elevator doors hadn't even closed when Letitia's phone buzzed with a red level alert from her security liaison. Orion Environmental Systems. Yes, the same shell company with more aliases than a mob accountant had just filed a legal request for access to the digital logs of her SUV. The justification? Unauthorized third-party interference. That third party, of course, was a teenage mechanic with a $12 soldering iron and more technical literacy than half the contractors sitting on DC defense panels. Letitia didn't respond with a press statement or a call to her comms director. She did something far more telling. She turned to Emily and said, "They know we're moving, and they want to see how scared we are. By the time they arrived at the Federal Coordination Center, a brutalist concrete tomb guarded by retinal scanners and men with more pins than IQ points, Emily was told to wait in the corridor. Not because she posed a threat, because she didn't fit the script. No badge, no clearance, no military haircut. Just boots, a flannel shirt, and a brain that made bureaucrats uncomfortable. Inside the room, the National Security Tech Director was likely reviewing a report stamped with too many acronyms and not enough comprehension. Outside, Emily leaned against a wall lined with government-issue motivational posters and flickering fluorescent lights. That's when a man in a tailored navy suit and smug haircut approached. No badge, no nameplate, just tone. The kind that smiles like it's doing you a favor while loading the first shell into the shotgun of suspicion. "Have you had any contact," he began, "with foreign military personnel in the past 6 months?" No introduction, no context, just interrogation in a hallway that smelled like printer toner and coffee that had surrendered all hope. Emily didn't flinch, didn't answer. Instead, she reached toward the man's chest slowly, deliberately, and plucked the pen from his breast pocket. "Nice pen," she said. Then twisted the barrel, popped the clip off, and held up the internal mechanism. Active range signal booster, dual frequency, same signature as the tech I pulled from the SUV. He went pale, not visibly, but enough that the temperature around him seemed to drop 3 degrees. Emily leaned in, voice low and surgical. "If you're going to accuse me of espionage, at least make sure the gadgets in your own suit don't match the ones used in the surveillance op." He opened his mouth, perhaps to object, perhaps to explain, perhaps just to inhale and hope the oxygen would carry a better idea with it. But he didn't get the chance. Letitia James turned the corner like a verdict in motion. No coat, no smile, just that prosecutorial stillness she'd perfected during 2 decades of cross-examinations. She sized up the scene with one look. Emily holding a dissected listening device, the assistant blinking like a man who'd just met the plot twist in a novel he didn't realize he was in. "She's with me," Letitia said coldly. "You're not." The words landed like a gavel. There was no room for interpretation, not even a chair to fall into. The aide stepped back, the pen still humming faintly in Emily's fingers. That was the moment the room, though small and windowless, tipped. Not because Emily had been vindicated, not because Letitia had vouched for her, but because the power dynamic had shifted in plain sight. Letitia hadn't said she's innocent. She hadn't said let her speak. She'd said she's with me. That phrasing, so deceptively simple, meant only one thing inside the hallways of government power. This person is now part of my war room, and that changes everything. You see, DC doesn't run on votes or logic. It runs on proximity. Who gets invited into the room? Who gets believed without proof? And in that moment, a girl with no official job title and an unauthorized intellect had been granted something far more valuable than a badge: relevance. The irony, of course, was staggering. A federal aide tried to frame Emily as a risk to national security using a bugged pen, and in doing so proved her point. This wasn't a game of protocols anymore. It was a game of exposure. And Emily wasn't the one getting caught. As the aide disappeared down the hallway, Letitia turned to Emily. "You okay?" Emily handed her the pen. "Depends. You want to know where else this exact component's been used?" Letitia smiled, not because she was amused, but because she finally realized what she was standing next to. Not a mechanic, Not a whistleblower. A walking audit of everything the system thought it had buried. And that's where the next phase begins, not with a leak, not with a press release, but with a private signal, a foreign signature, and a line of trust drawn in the middle of a corridor. Because if Orion wanted access, they were about to get something much worse. Attention. The war room, if one could even call it that, was barely the size of a mid-range conference suite at a Holiday Inn. The overhead projector buzzed like a lazy wasp. The monitors flickered on government issue delay, and the network still ran on an outdated encryption protocol Emily had bypassed by accident within her first 10 minutes in the building. But none of that mattered. Because inside that dim-lit, underfunded corner of federal intelligence operations, a 17-year-old with a soldering iron and a grudge was about to go hunting. And Letitia James? She was done playing defense. The plan wasn't ambitious. It was surgical. "We bait the signal," Emily said, calmly rolling a strip of copper wire between her fingers like she was twirling a pen. "We don't chase Orion. We make them chase us. I'll build a mimic node AI driven, with synthetic user feedback patterns, 70+ variables, enough to convince any remote ops suite that this is the real driver interface from your car." A senior analyst, whose resume probably included words like cyber consultant and coffee stain veteran, gave her a look like she'd just offered to fly to Mars using duct tape and sarcasm. "You're proposing to fake a full driving profile?" Emily didn't answer. She just reached into her bag, pulled out a cracked breadboard, 2 recycled processors, and a heat gun that looked like it had been salvaged from the Nixon administration. Then she plugged in, soldered, and coded without stopping to ask permission. Within 30 minutes, she had built what half the DoD budget hadn't. A portable, AI-enabled signal emitter designed to simulate a moving vehicle, complete with location pings, brake pattern shifts, and biometrics like seating pressure fluctuation, all tuned to Letitia's driver profile. While the engineers stood stunned like they were witnessing sorcery with a user manual in a different language, Emily muttered without looking up. "Your problem is you wait for the spec sheet. I build things no one's written standards for yet." That wasn't arrogance. That was clarity. When she booted up the transmitter, the room dimmed for a moment, not because of the power draw, but because suddenly everyone present knew something had changed. The mimic began broadcasting. Letitia's vehicle, or what Orion would believe was her vehicle, was now on the move, and within 2 minutes the bait worked. A signal lit up on the satellite trace map, a live handshake request. Not spoofed, not routed through 6 VPNs, direct, arrogant, desperate. Emily leaned closer. They took it. But they didn't mask the response path. Her fingers flew across the keyboard. Data's coming from a fixed node. Maryland. Rural grid. Possibly underground. Signal is clean. That's not a relay. That's a command center. One of the federal techs opened his mouth to object something about protocol, warrants, airspace jurisdiction. But Letitia raised a hand. No. She just cracked open the pipe. "Don't tell me we're going to waste it choking on red tape." On the screen, a blinking red dot pulsed like a heartbeat. The room held its breath. And then, for the first time since she'd been dragged into this mess, Emily looked at Letitia not with skepticism, not with guarded calculation, but with resolve. "I'm done proving the signal's real," she said. "I want to see what they do when they think they've been compromised." There was no more room for doubt, no time for risk assessments written by cowards with pensions. Orion had taken the bait, and in doing so revealed not just their location but their appetite. They weren't observers, they were operators, embedded, responsive, confident enough to ping a decoy because they didn't believe anyone on this side of the firewall could bite back. Well, they were wrong. And Emily wasn't asking questions anymore, because this wasn't about catching spies. This was about confronting the possibility that the enemy had never breached the walls. They helped build them, and the next move would be made not in silence, but in full signal strength. The warehouse in Maryland was designed to look forgettable. Sheet metal walls, a fake environmental logo, a couple of solar panels nailed on like PR band-aids. A company called Orion Environmental Systems filed as a regional contractor for soil remediation, air quality assessment, and other government-approved euphemisms for nothing to see here. But the moment federal boots hit the ground, the facade peeled off faster than a campaign promise in an election year. Inside, the operation didn't smell like chemicals. It smelled like firmware, racks of servers, thermal dampeners, and machines that hummed at frequencies most civilians don't even register. This wasn't a lab. This was a control node, military grade, off-grid, and surgically embedded within American soil. Letitia James stood back from the command feed, her arms crossed, eyes narrowed. She wasn't the one leading the physical raid, but make no mistake, this was her call. She had pulled the trigger. The official authorization had read, "Search and seizure environmental compliance breach." But the agents knew better. The only thing toxic inside that building was the code. Emily wasn't on site. She stayed in the war room, her face lit by screens, fingers dancing over encrypted channels like a concert pianist who just happened to specialize in demolishing clandestine networks. "They'll trip a burn protocol within 30 seconds of breach," she said flatly. "Everything digital in that facility is already rigged to evaporate. But if they have a command node..." She trailed off, already typing. Seconds later, the breach team confirmed entry. Predictably, the data systems inside Orion began to self-destruct, files vanishing mid-transfer, circuit boards melting like wax. But Emily wasn't watching the footage. She was watching the air. Her algorithm didn't target storage. It targeted signals. As the servers shredded themselves, a small anomalous stream lit up on her feed, an outbound packet, moving sideways instead of fleeing. "That's not a standard dump," she muttered. "It's a misdirection ping. They're trying to reroute the command signal through a sleeper repeater." She recoded live. Her reflexes weren't born in training. They were born in garages fixing problems no manual ever acknowledged. Within 5 seconds, she hijacked the reflection loop. Within 10, she isolated a block of data that hadn't made it to self-destruct. What it revealed stopped even Letitia cold. 12 devices, all advanced iterations of the bug Emily had discovered. But these weren't passive surveillance tools anymore. They were active response units loaded with adaptive firmware, encrypted in a format first spotted years ago in joint military exercises along the Korean Demilitarized Zone, a cipher architecture known only to a very specific class of foreign industrial systems, specifically ones maintained in the northern half of the peninsula. Letitia didn't reach for a mic. She didn't call a press briefing. She leaned into the intercom that connected her to internal intel staff and said calmly, "This is no longer about a single compromised vehicle. This is a structural infiltration. They're not eavesdropping. They're engineering leverage inside the American power grid, from the engine block outward." Her words hit like a cold slap across the room. Even the agents, hardened by years of domestic surveillance cases, stood still. Because this wasn't about spyware. It was about soft warfare aggressors that didn't fire bullets but embedded influence into systems so deep the user would think they owned it, until the day the system stopped responding. Behind them, Emily watched the intercepted code scroll across her terminal. Her posture didn't change, her voice didn't rise, but when she finally spoke, it sliced through the hum of unease like a precision drill. "I told you," she said. "They don't use what's available. They make what no one else is brave enough to imagine." It wasn't boasting. It was a eulogy for every smug analyst who thought cyber war would come with flashing red alerts and klaxons, for every bureaucrat who assumed procurement policy was protection, for every decision-maker who thought environmental systems was just another line item in a state contract. And, for the first time, no one doubted her. Because the only thing more dangerous than a foreign adversary installing hardware inside your government fleet is that they did it while wearing a recycling logo and billing it as sustainability. But this was no longer a theory. This was evidence. And now, the only question left was who signed the invoice. Letitia didn't write her report with flourishes. She didn't need to. When the Attorney General of New York sends a classified memo to both the Department of Justice and the National Security Council in the same breath, it's not for literary merit, it's because someone at the top needs to stop pretending the problem is theoretical. Her request was blunt: a full-scale federal investigation into Orion Environmental Systems, international origin tracing of G11 class materials, and immediate elevation of a previously unknown Bronx-based mechanic to the status of technical advisor on critical anomaly detection. Her name, Emily Walker. Age, 17. Resume, non-existent. Credibility, indisputable. It didn't take long before the procession began. A swarm of officials in black suits and thin smiles descended like a flock of government-trained vultures, pretending to be impressed while hoping to disprove. They grilled Emily in a windowless room lined with magnetic shielding and redundant microphones. They asked about her knowledge of signal theory, embedded firmware, network misdirection, thermal camouflage, encryption entropy. But they weren't seeking understanding. They were seeking containment. They wanted to know how this girl had humiliated an interagency surveillance failure with nothing more than a soldering pen and suspicion. Emily didn't entertain their condescension. She didn't present theories or cite papers. She opened a drive, laid out time-stamped logs, reverse-simulated the decoy loop, and replicated the adaptive firmware behavior in under 7 minutes. "You don't need my background," she said. "You need my model, and unfortunately for you, it's not in your database. Yet." A Defense Department official, bald, over-decorated, and absolutely certain he was the smartest person in the room, leaned forward. "We'd like to invite you to a secure research group on active response system shielding. It's led by DARPA, and Emily cut him off. Will I have editorial control over the architecture? Or am I just signing off on a black box someone else built?" The room paused. The general's lips pressed thin. "You'd be working with experts," he said carefully. Emily smiled. "Experts are how we got here." Letitia, watching from the side, stepped in before the conversation could collapse under its own self-importance. "She's not for sale," she said, turning toward the others. "She's being supported, not absorbed." And with that, she pulled the final string. Using her authority at the state level, Letitia formally recommended Emily for an unprecedented technical scholarship, one not offered, advertised, or designed for someone like her. The National Institute of Engineering had never accepted anyone under 21 without a formal degree. Emily had a GED, a backpack, and a notebook filled with code no one in the building could decipher without a glossary. They made an exception. The press, of course, caught wind within days because silence is a fantasy and leaks are Washington's preferred method of storytelling. Politico ran the first headline: Teenage mechanic uncovers foreign surveillance in NY Attorney General's car. The New York Times, not to be outdone, went with something blunter. From spark plugs to spy rings, the girl who caught Orion. Cable news spun themselves into hysteria trying to frame the narrative. Was she a savant? A fluke? A threat to national defense just because she made the Pentagon look like it had been asleep at the wheel? Emily didn't take interviews, but someone leaked a clip from an internal seminar, her first briefing to a classified group of security contractors. In the clip, someone off-camera asked her how she managed to spot the device in Letitia's SUV when so many experts missed it. Her answer? If they don't invite you into the room, maybe check who wired it. It went viral in under an hour. Suddenly, Emily wasn't just a name on a report. She was a narrative, a symbol, a threat. Not because she was dangerous, but because she refused to play by the script written for people who don't wear suits, don't speak in acronyms, and don't wait for permission to notice the obvious. And as the press spun theories and pundits argued over whether she was inspirational or unregulated, Emily returned to her temporary lab and did what no one expected. She went quiet again. But not because she had nothing left to say, because she was already working on what came next. And if you think Orion was the last node in this story, you haven't been paying attention. They didn't give Emily Walker a student ID. They gave her lab clearance. No orientation, no dorm assignment, no tour of campus with pamphlets and plastic lanyards. On her first day at the National Institute of Engineering, she was issued biometric access to an R&D wing typically reserved for visiting foreign dignitaries and defense contractors who wore credentials like armor. She wasn't there to learn, she was there to build, and everyone knew it. The room fell quiet when she walked in. Not from intimidation, but from recognition. Not a single person in that state-of-the-art amphitheater dared ask who she was because the professor beat them to it. He didn't introduce her. He issued a statement. "We are all sitting here," he said, "because one person in this building caught what the rest of us missed." She didn't write the rules. She just reminded us that security doesn't come from hierarchy. It comes from competence. That kind of introduction makes tenure holders nervous, especially the kind who'd spent years perfecting the art of sounding cutting edge without ever cutting into anything. But Emily wasn't here for applause. She wasn't here for approval. She was here because no one else had built what she had, and now they wanted in. It didn't take long before the past came knocking. A junior engineer, someone who had once openly mocked her during a military roundtable, found himself standing awkwardly by her lab bench, hands behind his back, carrying an apology with all the grace of a wet cardboard box. "I didn't think you," he began, voice cracking. Emily didn't look up. She adjusted a thermal stabilizer on the prototype she was tuning. "The mistake wasn't that you didn't know," she said evenly. "It's that you assumed I couldn't. No bitterness, no venom, just the quiet, surgical edge of someone who had outgrown the need to defend herself." At the weekly innovation meeting, a usually stagnant exchange of PowerPoint slides and jargon warfare, Emily skipped the preamble. She proposed a real-time anomaly detection loop using reactive AI, a self-learning node that could scan electromagnetic signals for live manipulation and trigger neutralizing feedback. The same concept the military had shelved 2 years prior because it was deemed infeasible outside of classified cloud infrastructures. She handed them a diagram, then a demo. "It's not only feasible," she said. "It's already running. I built it last month with surplus boards and half a Raspberry Pi." Silence. Then the head of systems integration, a man who looked like he'd aged 12 years in the last 10 minutes, stood up and approved an emergency trial. No vote, no debate, just one sentence. Green light the test, effective immediately. Emily didn't react. She didn't fist pump. She didn't tweet. She returned to her station, opened her battered notebook, and scribbled one new line in the margin beneath a sketch of the updated architecture. Day 1. Version 3. They're finally listening. And that's the difference between revolution and recognition. The former happens in headlines. The latter happens when the people who once dismissed you start forwarding your blueprints to their bosses and pretending they helped. The breakthrough wasn't the algorithm. It was the access. Emily had spent years banging on the door of a system that didn't just refuse to open it, denied she existed. Now the system was silent, listening, adapting, like the tech she'd taught it to mimic. But adaptation works both ways, and what they hadn't realized yet was that Emily wasn't just writing code. She was rewriting expectations, not just about what machines could do, but about who gets to build them. And this, dear listener, is where things stop being about national security and start being about institutional humility. Because while the generals were still reading from last year's doctrine, Emily had already updated the firmware on the machines and on the minds that once doubted her. And what came next wouldn't wait for committee approval. The room wasn't grand, no marble pillars, no dramatic lighting, no velvet-curtained stage. Just a concrete conference hall in the State Strategy Office of New York, where revolutions don't usually happen. But on that day, one quietly crystallized. The audience included no red carpets and few smiles, just lawmakers, intelligence officials, university deans, and the occasional power broker pretending they'd seen this coming all along. At the center of it, Emily Walker stood next to Letitia James, not behind her, not beneath her, next to her. No badge, no title, just a box in her hands. Letitia didn't clear her throat or read from a script. She simply opened the small metal container and turned it around for the cameras. Inside, nestled in black velvet, was a single bronze plaque. No logos, no seals. Just an engraving. Emily Walker didn't ask permission to do what was right. The applause that followed wasn't wild. It wasn't the kind of thunder politicians engineer. It was sharper, cleaner, like the moment everyone realized the rules had already changed and they were just catching up. They waited for Emily to say something. She didn't offer a TED talk. No prepared remarks. No slow, dramatic cadence. Just one sentence, spoken like an observation instead of a declaration. I didn't come here to be acknowledged. I came here to prove that silence is sometimes the operating system of resistance. Silence followed, appropriately. One journalist, maybe too caffeinated or too hopeful, raised his voice. Then who are you now, after all this? Emily turned, not to the press pit, but to the engineers at the back, some of whom had once dismissed her as the mechanic girl. She looked them in the eye, steady and unblinking, then answered, "Am someone who understands that if you can take something apart to fix it, you can rebuild it better. Not flash, not philosophy, just architecture for both machines and systems." No one clapped. Not yet. Not because it wasn't powerful, but because it was undeniable. A few started writing it down. A few others simply sat with the discomfort that their own institutions might need disassembly. And that, perhaps, was the most powerful thing she'd said all day. Afterward, the cameras turned off, the suits shuffled out, and the headlines were already writing themselves. Walker named independent advisor. State honors teen tech hero. Garage mechanic disrupts national surveillance. But the real ending wasn't in the press room. It was in the basement garage of the building, where Letitia and Emily stood in front of the same SUV that had launched the investigation months ago. The car was cleaned, repainted, repaired, but when the hood lifted, a small, deliberate addition glinted under the work light. A steel plate, unlabeled except for one laser-etched line, tucked beside the engine mount. Started beneath the hood, ended on the map of power. Letitia folded her arms, gave a half-smile that meant both relief and warning. You realize this isn't over. Emily didn't look away. It shouldn't be, because this was never about just one car, one bug, one girl. It was about who gets to decide what's visible, what's valuable, and what's possible. And for once, the answer didn't come from a committee. It came from under the hood,